Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed Battlerites champion guide. Today we will be looking at Pearl and see why she is so good. Pearl is a ranged support champion who mainly heals her teammates and disrupts her enemies with silences and projectile slowing bubbles. She deals moderate damage and is actually quite a straightforward support champion to play, since her abilities mostly have well-defined purposes. However, her abilities do take a little getting used to for them to be used effectively. Before we start, just like the Jade guide previously, I have split the guide up into different sections and I've included timestamps directly to each section in the description below, so you can feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. Like before, we'll start by looking at her abilities, then her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. After that, we'll look at her Battlerites options, and finally finishing off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos with Pearl. And so, without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about her abilities. Her left click ability is Volatile Water. This ability is your main damaging ability, since Pearl is a support champion and so has limited damage output. It does a fair amount of damage and has a decently long range, but it's fairly slow to cast and it makes you stop moving, so you need to get used to casting it and aiming with it to output consistent damage as Pearl. When your staff is charged, and there will be a few ways to achieve this which I will go through later in the video, Volatile Water will do increased damage and even silence the enemy for some time, making it a very strong ability for disrupting the enemy. Just be sure to not miss your target when you know your staff is charged, otherwise it'd be a waste of bonus damage and silence. Next up, her right click ability is Healing Wave, and this is her direct healing ability. Very simple, just aim and heal, but bear in mind the projectile speed when healing teammates that are far away, and also that you require enough charges to use the ability, but that will replenish over time. Her spacebar ability is Dive, and it is a primary escape ability. Dive will deal some damage to nearby enemies when you submerge, before transporting your character to your targeted location. Very straightforward. Her Q ability is Tidal Wave, and this is Pearl's counter ability. Using Q lets Pearl stand still and counter a melee or projectile attack, while knocking back and dealing damage to nearby enemies. It will also heal you and, more importantly, recharge your staff. So bear in mind to aim properly after countering, since you would want to make that improved Mouse 1 ability worth it. Be careful and try to remember that this ability does not counter beam and AoE type attacks on you. Next up, Bubble Barrier is her E ability, and this is one of her signature ability, which allows her to slow projectiles and enemies within it. Upon casting, the ability also knocks enemies and yourself away from the center of the bubble, which can sometimes be useful when dealing with melee champions who have gotten close. Be careful as well not to push yourself into bad positions, because this happened to me far too many times. Moving on to her abilities that cost energy, her R ability is Bubble Shield. Bubble Shield puts a shield on an ally, removing all negative effects as well as shielding up to 30 damage while it is up. I find that this ability is one of her better defensive abilities, since it is an instant cast and can save lives very quickly. Just don't forget that this ability costs 25 energy, because it is quite easy to not realize you don't have enough energy in the heat of battle to shield an ally or yourself. Her ultimate ability, Jaws, summons a big fish thing to eat up enemies in an area before spitting them back out again after a couple of seconds. While waiting for them to be spitted out, Pearl can redirect the landing site to allow for combo potentials with other hard-hitting AoE abilities by teammates. It is huge if you can pull Pearl's ultimate off on multiple enemies, but just be wary of the delay between the cast and the ability actually activating on your enemies, since enemies have ample time to get out using their escape cooldowns, or even just walk out if they are near the edges of the AoE. Sometimes, if I realize that my enemies are very good in avoiding my ultimate, I prefer to spend my energy on my other abilities if my teammates don't have good AoE abilities to follow up after my ultimate anyways. Finally, her EX abilities. Her first EX ability is Overflow, and it just basically recharges your staff after a short cast time, allowing you to do increased damage and silence your enemies with your next Mouse 1 attack. You can spend 25 energy to recharge your weapon by pressing Shift left click or the number 1, but there's a few ways to recharge a weapon that I very seldom use this ability if at all. Last but not least, her other EX ability is Unstable Bubble. and this ability modifies her E ability. Instead of spawning a bubble that only slows enemy projectiles and enemies within it, this ability summons a red version of the bubble that explodes after some time and knocks enemies away from the center while dealing damage to them. There is, however, no knockback upon casting this ability, so there is a bit of difference with the base E ability there. And that's all of Pearl's abilities listed out and explained to you one by one. We can now move on to her playstyle, strengths, and weaknesses. To me, Pearl's playstyle is quite slow but methodical. I feel that the pacing of her playstyle is such because of her slow casting mouse 1 ability. Her slow casting but powerful mouse 1 ability makes it so important to make each shot count, since Pearl's movement has to stop when trying to attack with it. Pearl is very vulnerable to AoE attacks or stuns while she's trying to attack, so I feel that she is one of the few champions who should not be simply spamming her left click, but instead taking her time to aim and shoot each one. This is even more true when her weapon is recharged to really make that silence and extra damage count. Even with the charged weapon shot, her damage output is still not very high, so those charged shots should usually be aimed at enemies who are just about to engage with your teammates or yourself to silence them and leave them vulnerable to your team's attacks. The methodical part of Pearl's playstyle comes from the reactive nature of her abilities, which I suppose is this way because she is a support champion after all. Use R when teammate is in danger, use E between teammates and enemy range champions, use Q when enemy attacks incoming, and so on, makes for a pretty engaging experience since it feels like every decision and move counts. Playing a little slower with Pearl is a good thing as well, since careful planning and placement of her ultimate is also quite key at times, and it allows for combo potential and very satisfying victories. So, from this, we can see what Pearl's strengths are. She can be very disruptive by silencing the enemy a lot, disrupting the enemy's flow especially when they feel like they're in an advantageous position. She also has a strong support toolkit with her direct heals, her bubble barrier slowing those projectiles down, and her bubble shield to get teammates or herself out of sticky situations. She has large combo potentials with quite a few other champions, all because of her ultimate as a setup, even though it can be quite hard to hit multiple enemies with it sometimes, and that is one of her weaknesses. Her ultimate, being as powerful as it is if it hits, is weak when it doesn't, and unless the enemy is already immobilized, it usually doesn't hit if they have an escape cooldown ready. Another weakness of Pearl's is her immobility. Casting her mouse 1 and mouse 2 ability requires her to stop completely, making it extremely easy for large AoE abilities to hit you, like Sirius's Petrify ability or Rook's Rock Throw ability. Pearl is also weak when the enemies know how to play around her escape cooldowns. If enemies don't activate her counter or use AoE abilities while she attempts to counter, Pearl is left very vulnerable, leaving her with only one escape option left, which is a dive ability. Occasionally, she might be able to separate herself from melee champions trying to stick to her by placing her E ability in between her and the melee champion, but it is unreliable at times, especially if some other ranged champion is trying to hit you at the same time. And so, that's all of Pearl's main strengths and weaknesses. Let's move on to her Battlerites options. As with my previous Jade video, you can pause the video to slowly read through all the Battlerites options if you wish, and I will then go through my picks for Pearl's Battlerites after that. So pause now if you want to read through all the Battlerites options one by one. Alright, now that you've read through all the Battlerites, let's continue. In the first tier, I think that Power of the Deep will be the go-to option most of the time. As I've mentioned before, Pearl's charged attack is one of her core abilities, and so giving her one more way of getting her weapon charged is super powerful. Ocean Sage can be useful in some situations, like when the enemy team is all ranged champions, including ranged supports, since the extra bubble barriers will make it just that little bit harder for those ranged attacks to hit you and your teammates. Fountain would only really be good in 3 vs 3s, I feel. In 2 vs 2s, it's only okay, because you really wouldn't want to be taking too much damage yourself anyways, and so you'll be trying to avoid damage instead of trying to heal through it yourself. And so 90% of the time, take Power of the Deep. On to the tier 2 Battlerites. I think all 3 Battlerites have their own place, with splash damage maybe having a bit of an edge over the other 2. Sea Bubble is good against multiple ranged enemies, and Healing Stream is decent when you're being focused and you need that reduced dive cooldown. If you don't find the need for Sea Bubble or Healing Stream, Splash Damage is the way to go then. It will punish enemies for staying too close together, and if your enemy is close to a wall, the projectile will actually hit the wall and still hit the enemy, making it easier on you to deal some damage on the enemy that way. Pearl's Tier 3 Battlerites has a few interesting options. Douse is pretty handy for sticky situations and sometimes even for aggressive situations too, since the Fading Snare can help you hit your charge shot on the enemy that you've snared. Bubble makes Bubble Shield essentially free to cast if you timed it right, making it a pretty solid choice too. And finally, Water Walk can help you to reposition that much better against those pesky long range champions or even melee champions who have gotten close. So in this tier, I think that they all have their niches and none of it are significantly better than the other two. Personally, I like to use Bubble if I can't really decide which one to pick, since having a free Bubble Shield allows for more uses of Pearl's ultimate for potential offensive plays as well, in addition to its defensive uses. Moving on to Pearl's Tier 4 Battlerites, I think that Soaking Wet would be the top choice most of the time. Aegis, similar to the other Battlerites, that lets you to do more damage to opponents below 30% health that are found in other champions, isn't that great because the effect only comes into play at a specific time in the round, and it doesn't give you any bonuses throughout the round, making it a very bad deal. What's more, this Battlerites needs you to be below 30% health to help you, which I think is just bad. You're better off trying to stay above 30% health, and I think the other Battlerites are better at doing that. Tasty Fish could be good when fighting multiple melee enemies, since you need to be near the bubble barrier to pick up the fish to heal you. When fighting against ranged enemies, the bubble barrier is most disruptive to your enemies when it is near them, making the Battlerites a little bit weak against ranged enemies. Soaking Wet increases your silence duration from your charge shots by 50%, making it a very solid choice, and it is always useful throughout all the rounds. I'd say Soaking Wet is the choice, like 99% of the time in this tier. Finally, Pearl's Tier 5 talents are very interesting. Tribute of the Sea is good when you're struggling to heal through your opponent's damage, and Presence of the Sea is good for that added bonus damage on your enemies, especially if you're splash damage, since you'll get to splash silence your enemies coming out of your ultimate. Both of the Battlerites are still good even if you don't hit your ultimate, since some extra healing is always nice, and another free weapon charge is also good. And so for this tier, I'd say pick Tribute if you have trouble surviving, and pick Presence if you feel you have the upper hand over your opponents in fights. So that's all I have on Pearl's Battlerites options. We'll now move on to some of my gameplay tips for Pearl and some potential combos with Pearl. The first tip for Pearl is positioning. Positioning is so crucial for Pearl because of how immobile she is while casting her basic abilities. Good opponents can punish your bad positioning very harshly and set you back on a lot of health, which is really bad for you. I find it is quite hard for Pearl to fight from behind precisely because of how immobile she is. And so it is super important as Pearl to not get stuck in bad situations, more so than other champions I feel. Another tip I have for Pearl is to take it slow with her attacks. And by that I mean to only shoot when you feel confident that you will hit the enemy. I've mentioned about how she has to stop to cast her attack, making her very vulnerable, so it is my advice to cast it only when you feel confident that it will at least hit and when it is also safe to do so. The same is even more true for those charge shots. Moving on, I also have some tips for using Bubble Barrier. You probably picked up on these as I was going through the guide already, but I'll summarize it here. For me, Bubble Barrier has two main uses. I usually use it near ranged enemies to slow the attacks coming from them, and I also use it between melee enemies and myself to push us apart. So basically, as sort of a pseudo escape ability to create distance between the melee champions and myself. Since the barrier slows enemy movements as well, it is unlikely for them to run through the barrier to chase you. The EX version of the barrier ability, Unstable Barrier, sounds good in theory, but it is actually very easy for the enemy to move out of it, unless you or your teammates have a way to keep them in. So most of the time, I'd still stick to the normal barrier ability instead, since they do mostly the same thing if the damage doesn't connect with the enemy. My final tip for playing Pearl is to not be stingy with your energy. Use those bubble shields and recharge your weapon during downtimes as well when you need it. There's still a time and place for Unstable Barrier, despite it sometimes not hitting the enemy, so don't hesitate to use those abilities if you need to. It is not always ideal to save for the right time to use the ultimate because it is inconsistent as well. If you do use it and miss, you're left vulnerable without energy to shield yourself with R, and it can sometimes be disastrous. But of course these all depend on the situation also, and it'll take some time and practice to make good calls with what to do with your energy at each given time. On to combos with Pearl. I think champions with huge damaging AoE abilities can combo well with Pearl. Champions like Ashka, Ezmo, Sirius, and a few others can all pair up well and have combo potential with Pearl's ultimate, whether in 2 vs 2s or 3 vs 3s. Because of Pearl's versatility, it doesn't matter much if Pearl's teammate is ranged or melee. She has abilities that can support both types of teammates just as effectively. Shields for melee champions and barriers to help out ranged teammates against enemy ranged champions and so on. Not to mention her heals on her teammates, so it doesn't really matter. All these make Pearl a very versatile support that should be able to fit in most comps quite well. And so yeah, that's it for my Pearl guide in this episode of my detailed champion guide series for Battlerite. For the next Battlerites video, I'll be uploading an Ashka guide as soon as I'm done with it. There will be Rainbow Six Siege content in between these guides as well, since I've been enjoying myself with the new Season 4 content for Rainbow Six. Be sure to check those videos out as well if you play Rainbow Six Siege. I have put out a poll which you can access by clicking the I button at the top right of the video to vote for which Battlerites champion guide you would like to see next after Ashka's guide. Anyway, I hope you found what I covered in this video useful and you enjoyed watching the video. If you did, be sure to like, comment and subscribe and share this video with your friends, and I'll greatly appreciate all of your support. Check out my other videos as well if you fancy. Have a nice day and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.